Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices webcast, and this time we wanted to concentrate on the SharePoint PnP JavaScript call library, which is called also the sp-pnp-js library, available in the NPM gallery as well. So the SharePoint PnP JavaScript library is kind of a nice JavaScript library which is increasing the productivity of the developers when you are doing development towards SharePoint Online or also in on-premises. And in this webcast we wanted to kind of go through the history of this library and also how it works, and also some of the future thinking around this one. My name is Esa Juvonen. I'm a senior program manager from SharePoint Engineering, and with me today as the main presenter is Patrick Rogers, the man behind of the sp-pnp-js. So Patrick, will you do the intro?
Hello, I am Patrick Rogers. I'm a senior program manager in Office 365, and we've been working on the sp-pnp-js core library for about a year now, but we'll go through that a little bit more in the history section. So happy to be here, happy to have the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's agree that, well, Patrick can actually take over the presentation, and I'll jump in and ask questions whenever suitable. So Patrick, take it away.
Sure, thanks, Vesa. We're going to go over today, we get the question a lot from the community, what is the sp-pnp-js? How do I use it? Why does it exist? How does it relate to SharePoint Framework? And we've actually done, I think, 2 of these webcasts. This will be the third, kind of what is this library? And we kind of like to revisit that because everything evolves constantly. So we want to kind of update the community on where we're at and what our thinking is, and then, of course, get feedback and grow from there. And when we do the 4th one of these recordings, it'll be a little bit different in the future as well. So today we're going to go over the history, kind of where we got to where we are, the current state, so where we are. We're going to talk about the relationship with SharePoint Framework, how they fit together and how they don't, and just sort of where we see that. And then the future goals of the library and how we're thinking about growing it. And then, of course, as always, we think about the feedback from the community. But first, jumping in, let's talk about the history of the library a little bit. So we started over a year ago. Vesa and I had the opportunity, along with a bunch of MVPs and some other folks, to attend what at the time was called a developer kitchen. And this was the first semi-public, because it was an invite-only event, but semi-public introduction of the SharePoint Framework, or what would become the SharePoint Framework. It was a much more limited thing at that point. But we both looked at each other at the end of, I think, day 2 and said we should start a library similar to the Patterns and Practices CSOM library that's existed now for probably almost 3 years. And it's there. If you've used the managed code library, it's a helper library. The idea is to be very lightweight, to have minimal dependencies, and to be easy to use and to help you in your day-to-day tasks. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to start something for the JavaScript community, for the client-side development community. That's something that Patterns and Practices, we had some examples, but not a very heavy presence, or not really a library as such you could take and use. And we definitely had the goal of complementing SharePoint Framework and SharePoint client-side development in general. And I think that idea, we'll talk about that a few times throughout today's session, but that idea of complementing the functionality is we're really looking to work with SharePoint Framework and client-side development to help folks and not really take over and not be an obstacle, but be a tool in the tool bag you can reach into and pull out to make your lives a little bit easier. And the other reason we started it was before we could announce SharePoint Framework publicly and really tell folks what was coming and talk about the use of the modern web stack in SharePoint and things like that, it was a way to introduce sort of these concepts like gulp and GitHub and NPM and so forth to traditional SharePoint developers who have done full trust code development or add-in development, and who might have even done a lot of client-side development, but typically in like a script editor web part, to some of these what folks are calling modern web development concepts. And so that was a way to sort of start the learning process and start that roadmap for folks before the SharePoint Framework announcement. So that's kind of the history of why we got started, that idea of a helper library similar to the CSOM library, complementing folks' development tasks, and then as well introducing sort of our learning roadmap prior to the release of the SharePoint framework or any kind of mention of that publicly.
Yeah, that was kind of hard time at the time because we couldn't be able to explain why are you doing all of this Gallop nonsense in quotes. Obviously, it's not nonsense, but it's like no. This is where we're heading. This is the future web stack development story, which was kind of awkward for a few months until the 4th of May announcement, and then it all made a lot of sense. So.
Yeah, and we did after that get a lot of folks come back and say, "Oh, I get it now."
Yes.
Which was good to hear because I think it was tough when you kind of were saying, "Well, trust us." But you can't really tell people why. So sure. I think it was good. I think we did a pretty good job of getting the message out in a secretive way. And I think we only hinted about what was coming 2 or 3 times. I don't know.
Something like that. Yes, indeed. So where are we?
Where are we today? Current state. Well, after about a year of development, we've got a robust library that's based on the underlying REST API for SharePoint. And it's a Fluent API. We do monthly releases now, and those releases are driven very much by community feedback. So people reporting issues and folks also reporting not necessarily issues that are wrong, but features they'd like to see, capabilities that don't exist, or that they'd like to see enhanced. So that feedback is a really important piece of driving those monthly releases, and those releases are aligned now to the larger master releases in the Patterns and Practices program. So we've gotten everything aligned there, which I think is going to be helpful. And we're constantly improving our docs and guides. There's a developer guide out there now as part of the wiki on the GitHub site. It doesn't cover everything, but we're working to improve it daily, and so it covers quite a lot of stuff. It should help you get started. There's also a sample add-in. We've got SharePoint Framework samples, and then we've got samples around using it with a script editor web part. And that's something we'll talk about in the demo section, but I think it's really important to see that this library will work whether you're doing traditional add-in development. It'll work from a SharePoint add-in web, so you can use the cross-web capabilities there. It'll work within SharePoint Framework, and as well you can use it just in a script editor web part on a page. So, or an included, like if you have a JS file and style library and you include it in, the library will work in classic SharePoint as well. To date, we're used in 419 tenants to make 8.6 million requests, and that was for the month of February. February 2017, if you're looking at this way in the future. But so that's phenomenal growth. So we're growing, we're almost doubling the number of requests each month, and we're going up 50 to 75 tenants a month at this point, which is really exciting to see that growth, and really exciting to see the folks that start using it, the usage doesn't drop off. So I think some clear benefits to folks using this library, which brings us to our next slide. So why would I use this? Why would I care? Why wouldn't I just use jQuery and construct my requests? You absolutely can still do that, of course, but what we're hoping is that this is helpful and going to take off some of the sort of tedious, repetitive work in all your projects. So, for example, we're handling the request digest and all the header settings for you. When you make requests, we're ensuring the correct JSON format and the type values. Like, for example, when you create a list item, you've got to have the list item type in that JSON body. Similar, if you're creating a list, you've got to have the sp.list type in there. We kind of take away the need to worry about that, and you can focus just on creating your lists and your items as needed. Easily batching things. If you've ever tried to do the REST request batching and write the parsing for that yourself, it can be a little tedious. There's a lot of code to write there to construct those batches. So we've made that easy to do in line with the Fluent API. And mentioning that Fluent API, again, it really guides you through building your requests. So even if you're not 100% familiar with SharePoint, and understanding that hierarchy of webs and lists and items and so forth, the API kind of guides you through that, because when you hit dot, as we're all familiar with, you'll get the IntelliSense, and that'll really sort of guide you as to what's available. For example, lists have items, lists have fields, etc. And you'll kind of see that right there in the IntelliSense as you're going through. And you'll get that type checking as well out of TypeScript. And then easily install, so you can add this to your projects with npm install sp-pnp-js. So it works across, I believe, pretty much every project type at this point. So SharePoint Framework, your own custom projects, React, Angular, all those sorts of things. Of course, if you have trouble, let us know. But we think at this point that install, nice and simple, works across all things. And then another key, I mentioned this earlier, and it's important to mention it again, it works with classic SharePoint, SharePoint Framework, and add-ins. So what this means is if you were to take our library and then start to build off of it and start to enhance it, that is something that's going to be portable for you. So if right now you might, in your company, be working on premises SharePoint 2013 or 2016, you're using our library, you can't use SharePoint Framework yet, but then your company is planning to move to the cloud, all of that work will be, perhaps with a few modifications, but generally speaking, all of that work will be transferable to SharePoint Framework, and as well transferable from, say, a script editor web part to add-ins, SharePoint add-in development, if with, again, possibly a few small changes, but overall, the bulk of that work will be able to transfer between any of those three kind of environments, for lack of a better term there, or development paths. And then the library is fully extensible. We are working to tell that extensibility story better. So there's some good articles out there in the wiki and that developer guide I mentioned earlier. So do encourage you to check those out. And we're working on making the library more extensible in the future. So that'll be a big part of upcoming releases as well. And so the ability to control the request pipeline, some other things like that. But right now we've got the ability, you can build your custom business objects, bind those directly to your templates. And there's a good example of that. There's a Knockout.js example we went over in one of the bi-weekly calls 2 weeks ago on that. So definitely check those things out. Definitely let us know if you have questions. But again, we're there to help, and we're there to complement your other development efforts. So hopefully making things easier and a little less repetitive. So to talk real quick about some basic use cases, and we'll do some live demos here shortly, but I think it's important to just sort of show a little bit of what using the library looks like, and sort of talk through that Fluent API. So at the top, you'll see an import statement. So if you haven't used TypeScript before, but say you're coming from a C# world, this would very much be like a using statement from C#. But so we're importing PNP, which is the default object, the default thing, out of the sp-pnp-js library. And we're also importing selectively the item update result object. We can import selectively other things such as web or list, things like that. And we'll see that in some of the examples. But it's important to note with TypeScript you can do this selective import, and we are exporting from our library many of our core objects, so you can pull those out and extend them in your applications as you need. But looking at the first example here, that is get all the items in my list. So you can see we're starting with our root object, pnp.sp for SharePoint. Should we ever branch out to other types of things such as graph, this gives us an entry point to SharePoint. And then we're saying web, lists, get by title, passing in the list title, my list, and then saying .items, and then we're saying get. So we're saying get all the items from the list, my list, and returning those. And so if you're not familiar with promises, promises are similar to jQuery deferred, but not exactly the same. But promises give you this idea of then. So get returns a promise, and we're saying then, once that promise resolves, we're going to get an array of items back, and we're just going to log that to the console. And so that will be all those items from that list. And so if you're familiar with the REST API, the underlying SharePoint REST API, you can sort of in your head imagine how that query is getting built out. So it ends up being webs/lists/get by title/items. would be the actual request that's going out. So that's another way that Fluent API is there to try and help, is that it very much is mimicking the query you're trying to build. So if you're looking at an example that doesn't use our library, of which there are very many out in the world, you can sort of follow through in our library by building that same query if you wanted to, or translate that into using this library. The second example,
Patrick, yeah, the second is really the second example is really showing the power of that one as well, because now you don't need to build that REST query. You don't need to remember how to actually make that happen. You have that top and order by, which is really, really great.
Yep, exactly. And so the second query is doing exactly the same thing as the first one. However, we've added two of the OData query parameters, top and order by. So top gives us 5 results. If we didn't specify order by, it would be whatever the first 5 are that come off the list, usually by ID. And then order by is telling it to order by this field. So as Vesa said, you don't have to remember how to construct that query string. You don't have to worry about any of that. You can just do it inline in your Fluent query and say, give me the top 5 items ordered by created, and get those. And we'll get 5 items back from my list. In order by created. And so we support all of the OData operators that are supported by SharePoint. So for example, skip, filter, things like that are also supported. And again, easily inline, you can do those things without having to build up your query, from scratch. And then the other thing I think is really important or key to show is you can update an item. Here we're getting item, I'm saying there's one that I happen to know has an ID of 5, but we're getting item ID 5, and we're updating it. And you'll notice if you've ever tried to build a REST query, you have to create kind of a multi-level JSON structure that has the item type and some other information in it, and then your fields, and send that along. Well, using the library, we take care of that for you. So this is, again, another thing we're doing to help to make things a little bit easier. And so you can see we're saying update, and we're just able to pass in a plain object with the fields we wanted to update. And we're getting back, again, one of the nice things about TypeScript is our results are typed, and so we're getting back an item update result, which is a custom piece of the sp-pnp-js library, and we're just logging that. But one thing that is important to point out, and we'll talk about that a little bit in some of the live demos, is that item update result has a .item property, which is actually an item queryable object from the sp-pnp-js library, meaning you could then immediately start chaining off of that updated item. So you might need to update your display on the screen. You'll have the data to do that. You might need to make some additional queries. You'll have the ability to do that very easily by chaining off these things.
And one thing to notice on the update is that you don't have to worry about the form digest or anything like that, or what's the JSON format or the post definitions and headers and everything like that. So it's super, super simple. So you might say that it increases productivity of the developers because you don't actually need to worry about all of that in quotes nonsense, which you need to always do when you operate against SharePoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking then a little bit at batching, I think it's really important just to show this example, and we'll look at it again a little bit in the live demos, but just how the batching fits right into the inline Fluent API model. So we're saying pnp-sp-web.get, but between there we've said in batch, and we've passed this batch instance we've got from the create batch method. And so you'll see we've got a then, and we're logging that web data that comes back. We're doing the same thing to get all the lists, and we're doing the same thing to get all the items from my list again. All of those 3 promises will resolve as you would expect, and the batch has a promise when you execute it that will also resolve once the other 3 promises have all resolved. So this is a way, again, to sort of do an update. So updates are supported. All requests should be supported in batching. So you can do your updates. You can add a lot of items in a batch. You could, get a lot of information in a batch. But then, you can have your batch.execute then, and that console.log that says batch is all done. Instead of just doing that, you could update your UI once all your batch activities had completed, or trigger some other thing that needs to happen once that batch is updated. But so we've been able to inject batching into our Fluent queries by simply adding the in-batch operator with no other effort, no other work, and all our promises and everything responds in the way we would expect them to respond. So we'll get those 3 console log statements will fire, and then the 4th batch is all done statement will fire. So again, really covering up and wrapping up a lot of that complexity in processing the batches and allowing you to just focus on, I want to use batching. I've added batching to my Fluent API chain. Batching will work now. So that's really the goal, is to make these things easy, make this stuff helpful, and get folks involved in using some of these capabilities that you may not have used in the past because it was just honestly too much of a pain to write that much code, to get batching to work. So moving then into a demo, what I want to show, and Vesa, I'll just get you to confirm that's popped up on your screen.
All good.
All good. So what I'm showing here, so this is actually, if you were to go fork the sp-pnp-js library, which I would, of course, encourage folks to do, you'll have this, which is the project folder structure. And what I'm just going to show today, I'm not going to go through a lot of the code in the library. I don't think that's the point of this particular webcast. But what I did want to show you is this debug folder. And I have some different demo files, but you'll have debug and you'll have example will be in there for you. But you can add these additional files. So if I look at the debug, you can see I'm setting up the Node fetch client. So one of the other nice things about the sp-pnp-js, it'll actually work from Node.js. So if you're doing Node development, you can run this on your sites. You'll have to register it as a provider-hosted add-in, go through that process. Or there's opportunities to use other third-party libraries to do your authentication. So you can certainly do that as well. And I've got a blog post on that out there you can check out. To use a third-party authentication, and then you can actually use user accounts or a couple other techniques. So Node Fetch Client, we're setting up a client ID secret in the URL. This is all done for you, but I'm just kind of showing you how this works. So we're subscribing a logger, so we've got kind of a very lightweight logging framework in the library, and then we're including an example. But I want to change this to be demo 1. So if you're not familiar with TypeScript, I'm saying import example, which happens to be a method, from the demo1 module, and then we're just going to execute that method. So if we look at the demo1 module, here is that function. So we're importing the PNP. Here I'm using a relative path because we're actually inside the project. I haven't installed it, but you would do sp-pnp-js in your projects. This is just simply inside the library. Looking at this example function, we're setting our active log level on the logger. We're ensuring we've got a list, and this list.ensure method is one we've added to the library, and what it does is first check to see if a list exists. If it does, it just returns that list to you. If it does not, it will create that list and then return it to you. And we get back a list add result, and then using that, again, we can chain directly off our result object. So our result.list is going to be that list, and that list has either been created or it's the one that already existed. And then we're using a method called getListItemEntityTypeFullName, which is a mouthful that gives you back the value you need to do updates or adds to a list. And so we're passing that into our batch as the second parameter, and this actually helps with performance. So again, we're showing batching, and again, we're chaining directly off our result list items in batch, add, and we're adding a new item with this title, 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 and then we're executing our batch, and all the items were added. And so if you fork this repository and you download it, you'll actually be able to hit F5 and run these debug examples. and debug examples you write on your own as well. So I've hit F5. It's going to take a little bit here to spin up. It's the first time today, so.
While waiting that to execute, actually, just out of curiosity, you did notice that you have a typo within your Twitter account name. No, it is actually correct in this example, but it's not a mediocre bowler. It's mediocre. Well, never mind.
Oh. Well, moving on.
Sorry.
You can't expect me to spell. So one of the things I'll show you here is we've got this debug console right here, and I'm using Visual Studio Code. You're going to see we've added a lot of logging, so you can actually see the request pipeline running. So we're getting a GET request, sending the request, and we've gotten an error here, and this is not found. Well, what does this mean? Should I worry about it? Well, this is the ensure method working. So it's saying the list demo list does not exist at the site. That's actually an expected error in this case, but we're still reporting it because it was an error from the server. But we then are actually handling it, and you can see we're beginning a post request to the lists. We're sending that request. We're completing it. We're doing a GET request now, and you can see we're selecting the list item entity type full name. So you can actually see these requests going out exactly as they're mapped in your queries. And so we're completing that GET request, and then we're beginning post requests. And so instead of all of these firing right away, because they're in a batch, down here below you're going to see batching requests. And then you can actually, each of these requests has an ID. So here's CDAC and the rest of it. Here's CDAC and the rest of it. So you can actually track your individual requests through this process. And then here's DAC and the rest of it. And we're completing that post request to that to create that item. And that's all then done in the batch. Yep.
And just a small side note on this one, obviously, the reason why you're getting this amount of information in the console is that you actually had the console locking setting set so high. So You're getting all of this information available.
Yeah, so you could set it up to warning or to error, and all of this would be hidden, except, of course, for these errors. And so all this is at the info level, and if you actually switch over to verbose, you're going to get everything that's happening. So you're going to get all the data that's returned from these requests and all the data that's getting sent with these requests. So if you're really stuck and really trying to debug something, for example, in like production, you could set up the console listener and dump everything that's happening in the library to the console. It's a lot of information to kind of wade through, but it can really help if you're in a situation where you're just stuck on something, you need to really dig through it. So that was an enhancement we made a couple releases ago based on sort of experience and us needing, myself needing better ways to debug. So we've run, all our things have completed, and we can, close that, stop that. So that's our example running here in Node, so showing that you can work in Node. And then I wanted to show you, sort of as the last part of the demo for this, I wanted to show you making something like this work in your browser. So if I switch over, I've got my SharePoint site here, and what I have here is a script editor on the page. And there we go. So I've got a script editor on the page, and what it's doing is a little complicated piece of script that says hello in a div. So sort of joking, not that complicated, but it did take me 2 tries this morning to get that to work. I couldn't spell element correctly. So if we look at this script, what I want to show you is the first thing we're doing is we're getting the pnp-js from localhost. Well, where is that being served from? And that's being served directly from our project using gulp serve. So very similar to SharePoint Framework, has a gulp serve command that does essentially the same thing. But you're going to see this is going to run Webpack and get everything going. And there we go. We're serving the file from that URL. So we're ready there. And the last thing, or the bottom of this file, not the last thing I'm going to talk about with this, is I'm using a Polyfill service. So we get a lot of questions around something's not working in IE 10, something's not working in IE 11. How do I deploy this across my organization where folks have many devices and many setups, browser setups that they're using? This Polyfill.io service, what it does is you can pass it sort of the set of features you want, and then as well a callback. And so what it does, it actually looks at what browser is making the request. So if it says, oh, you're IE 10, I know what capabilities you have and don't have, and it will send back a single Polyfill file with everything you need. And and you can specify which features. And in our case, I know our library, we need the stuff from ES6, and we need fetch. So if your browser doesn't have those, that Polyfill will come back. And then as callback, I just use the name stuff is loaded to make it kind of clear what is happening. But that callback will be called, and you can see once the Polyfill loads, here we're setting our div with the word hello. So this Polyfill is a great way if you're trying to deploy across your organization and you don't want to have 6 or 8 different Polyfill files and all that sort of thing, and you're okay with loading this from a CDN, and that fits your what you're trying to do, I think it's a great service. So what I want to do is I'm just going to grab this code right out of this function, and that code would run in Node, but instead I'm going to paste it here into what we're doing here in this script editor. And the only change I need to make is putting a $sign in front of the PNP, because the global PNP variable has a $sign in front of it. So we'll get our result back, and then we're going to chain off of that result using caching, and then using the logger, we're going to log it to the console. And so we're getting an error here that we can't edit or can't use a script. And so one thing, and this comes up a lot, and so I wanted to go over here, is because this is getting served from localhost, things are going to complain about it. And the way to kind of get around that is interesting.
I think you actually just stopped the Node.js, didn't you?
How did I do that? That was an accident. Apologies, folks.
That's fine. It's actually good to show how to get these things resolved.
I didn't know that I hit a key, but there I did. So you're getting this warning. So I'm going to say proceed to localhost. Now you see our file, and we'll refresh our page. Actually, let me save this again. And the script editor is on the page. And if we hit F12, what you can see here is all our data. So I've got a lot of items in that list. That's my large list testing. And if we look at the network, you'll see no requests went out. And what's interesting is because we kind of got a little bit out of order, is that if we look at our local storage, you can see our list data is stored in here. This one of these guys is it. So we've got our list data, so we're actually going to clear those. And if we refresh our page again, it's the problem with caching examples. You kind of got to catch it at the right time. If we look on network, you'll see here is our select that's going out. So you can look through, and this is something you can do when you're debugging as well. You'll be able to see, here's it's getting the fed auth cookies and setting the cookies. Here's all your request headers that have been sent that we've taken care of. Here's our query string parameters, so you can see it's doing the select title, and you can see the response we're getting back. And we look back at the network tab, you'll see we did not do that second request for items because we're caching it. So just wanted to show that you can take code that's running in Node, paste it into a script editor web part, a few minor changes, and then everything works as you would expect, which I think is another very powerful feature of the library.
And one thing to notice, actually, Patrick, if you go back still on the script itself, if you put the page in the edit mode, and just to kind of be super clear on this one as well. So right now, Patrick is showing the information on a script coming from a local host, but obviously in the real world, you could just as well get that JS file deployed, for example, the root side of your tenant or in your own CDN in Azure or Office 365 public CDN or whatever. So it doesn't really matter. But for the development time, this is pretty convenient because now you can easily access the files and access the information. You can debug that easily as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have the libraries published on CDN.js publicly as well, so you can use it from there, your own environment, however you need. One thing I guess we should mention, this is set up to watch your files. So if you were to come in here, make a change to the library, this would recompile. You could refresh your page right away and debug and see any problems. And then as well, if I go back on the F12, and if you look at sources, you're going to be able to look at your actual source files and set breakpoints and debug these things as the library is running. So because we've got the source maps published as well from the local host, it's a very better development experience than we had kind of when we first started. We put a lot of work into this, and we've made it a lot nicer for developing in the browser, testing things out, debugging things, and really getting down to figure out what's going on. And you can actually look at the CDN Polyfill file, what's coming back, so you can check that stuff out. Not much. I'm in Chrome, so we really don't need much at all from the Polyfill file, if anything. But so really neat, the ability then to just do these things and transfer that code again around to a script editor web part, to Node, to TypeScript, in SharePoint Framework, or even to add-in development, or your own project. So you can pull this into an Angular project or a React project that has nothing to do with SharePoint Framework and take advantage of some of these capabilities.
Yep.
So getting back to the slides then. So that was a real quick demo. We've got other demos out there, and we'll be doing more in the future. But hopefully that was a good kind of showing you some of the capabilities and why you might be interested in using the library. So we want to talk about now, move on a little bit to what is the relationship with SharePoint Framework. This is a question we get a lot from folks out in the community. Is there a relationship? Do you guys, the teams talk to each other, etc.? But to be very clear, first off, I wanted to say, and I think we all wanted to say, SharePoint Framework is the future of SharePoint client-side development. That is the product group delivered method for doing client-side development in the future. And we are here to complement that. We aren't trying to do our own thing or forge our own path. The sp-pnp-js library is absolutely here to complement SharePoint Framework, and we've worked hard to make sure it works easily inside of the SharePoint Framework, but it's not there to replace it or to sort of take folks down a different road at all. So I want to dispel that right away. There's certainly no competition between the two. SharePoint Framework, yeah.
And definitely not, because obviously the people and the team who is actually shipping SharePoint Framework does actually coordinate PnP as well. So it's not like it's two different teams, even in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I just kind of wanted to say that out loud because we kind of get that question and people, worry or wondering. So we're absolutely here to complement, and we're here, like we said before, to make those repetitive tasks easier, to make it so you don't have to know how to build all those JSON bodies, or even if you do know, you don't have to worry about it every time you just want to add an item, something like that. The other question we get a lot is, do I have to use the sp-pnp-js in SharePoint Framework? The answer, of course, is no, you don't. You can use the HTTP client that is provided in the framework directly. The only downside of that is you have to construct all of your queries on your own. If you're happy doing that or want to do that, have at it, no problem. But we hope, again, that we will help and be helpful, and you will use the library in a way that helps and makes your development experience much more efficient, and you don't have to constantly look up ways to do certain things. And I really view our relationship of the JavaScript core component to that of the Patterns and Practices Managed Code, or CSOM core component, and traditional SharePoint development. Do you have to use the core patterns and practices component? No, of course not. You can write all the code you need to do, but I think everybody that's ever used it has found it very helpful. There's a ton of extension methods in there that really bottle up a lot of code, and even the basic stuff of having the execute query retry method available has a tremendous amount of value, and it's something you don't have to. I know we've all spent that part of our lives copying, pasting, 16 code files to every project because we didn't have a way to do a reusable library. So the core component, managed code core component, aim to solve that, and we're aiming to solve the same sort of thing with the JavaScript core component. And the last question, what if there are conflicts in usage, or what if SharePoint Framework is doing things one way and you guys are doing things another way? My answer to that is to please let us know. We'd love to have a look, and we'd love to get aligned. I'm not aware of any conflicts, and like I said, our goal is certainly not to try and create a different or new way to do things that's not the same as SharePoint Framework. So if there are difficulties or conflicts or something could work better, that's the kind of feedback we're looking for. So again, SharePoint Framework is leading the way. We're here to help and complement that effort, and to really our goal is helping developers be more efficient and really take a lot of the repetitive work off your plate and put it in a reusable format that you can just load into your project and get to be productive and get to writing the business code that you need to write to solve your customers' problems.
One thing to add on this one, even though it takes a few minutes more time, is the discussion of, okay, so why didn't actually SharePoint Engineering ship this kind of a thing, or like PNP-JS core? Why aren't they shipping that kind of a simplicity or simplistic abstraction layer on top of the REST APIs? And the answer is, right now, at least, it's more convenient to do that with an open source community-driven initiative. Maybe at some point in the future, it might be part of the SharePoint Framework, or maybe SharePoint Framework turns into completely open source, because actually that's much more efficient way of doing stuff, together with community, making sure that everybody is happy about it, rather than engineering being hidden somewhere and releasing stuff without having that constant discussion with community on what's needed. So there's advantages and disadvantages in both options, no doubt. And right now, this seems to be working extremely well, that the sp-pnp-js is a separate library, and SharePoint Framework concentrates on the basics of SharePoint Framework. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? Yep.
And I guess two things I'll follow up on that. From the very beginning, it's funny to talk about the SharePoint Framework team because Vesa sits on that team. But from the very beginning of SharePoint Framework, starting with those developer kitchens, and then once it became sort of public in the pre-releases or the release candidates, is all about feedback. Everything is very feedback driven. And so if you want to get involved, folks are listening. Both for the JavaScript core component library, but also for SharePoint Framework as a whole. So it's not all open source at this point. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't be, but folks are still listening to feedback. So if you have issues, you have ideas, let us know. Let the folks know. Use the GitHub channels, use the community channels to let folks know.
Absolutely.
So really drive that feedback. And then the last point I'll say is, if there ever becomes a time in the future where there isn't a place for the PNP-JS core library, we'll look at discontinuing it. I mean, that's a simple conversation to have, that if all this functionality becomes part of SharePoint Framework, no need to maintain both things. Or if there's some other better utility out there, right? Things are constantly evolving and getting better, so we evolve with them.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So options, this slide is a nice comparison of the different ways to access data in SharePoint from SharePoint Framework. And so sort of going left to right, the first one is the JSON model, so the classic sort of execute query, async, stuff you've done. It mimics the client-side model, or the managed code client-side model very much. It works with delegates that you pass in. It does not support promises, which is, I think, makes for a little bit sloppier code. looks a little bit sloppier, I guess I should say, and it's not being invested anymore. I think that's a key point, is that's not going to be enhanced. So you can certainly import those libraries, use them inside SharePoint Framework, but there's going to be a day where that's less than optimal. The coverage is fair to good, I would say, of what you can do. But the ease of use, again, is hard. You've got to pull in some stuff that by default isn't part of SharePoint Framework. You've got to set up kind of that structure of saying objects, loads, and then execute query async, and then handling all those results and delegates and so forth. So a little bit hard to use. Yep, go ahead.
And it's really kind of a SharePoint specific as well. If you think of it, it's a SharePoint specific API. It's not a generic REST API as well. So you need to learn how to use this particular thing because it has its own quirks, so to say.
Yes. The next is raw REST. So benefits about that, it's the same across anywhere. REST is REST. So if you know how to write a REST query against some other system, you can write a REST query against SharePoint. It's super easy for the GET requests because you just put the URL in and say go. It's complex for the non-GET requests, because you have to construct those JSON bodies, but it's evergreen. So you're constructing all the requests, so as soon as an API is available in SharePoint, it's available to you to call. You just would have to build the request yourself, which means the coverage is always excellent. It's always 100%, because you can construct any query you want and send it through. So a lot of power, but no help for you, the developer. Yeah. It's all on your shoulders.
Not forgetting, obviously, the form digest as well, which you need to deal with for post operations.
Exactly. So you'd have to deal with that. You've got to deal with making sure the headers are all set. You've got to deal with processing the results that come back, because you can get different JSON formats back from SharePoint depending on what environment you're in, things like that. So it's a lot more work, in my opinion, but will always work, I think is important to say, and the coverage is always 100% across the SharePoint API. The next option is the sp-http client. So this is something that is part of the SharePoint framework. I think I mentioned it earlier. So it's SharePoint framework specific. It's easy for all kinds of requests. So what it does is take raw REST and sort of adds on top of that the request digest handling. So you're in charge of still building up the correct JSON post bodies and things like that, but it will handle getting the request digest, and it will give you back the results. Again, excellent coverage because you're constructing the URLs and queries at any point. It's a little bit easier to use because you don't have to worry about the request digest, but you still do have to build up your entire request bodies, which for GET requests, again, is dirt simple. For other requests, can be more complicated. So something to keep in mind. So it's sort of like raw REST with a little bit of help around the request digest. And then finally, the PnP-JS core. It has the Fluent API we looked at earlier. It works natively with promises, as does, I should say, the sp-http client works with promises as well, which makes for a little bit neater code, I think, a little bit easier to follow than having lots of delegates. You sort of chain your then statements together. And then it's open source and community driven. So if there's a feature that you really want, you can build it and submit a pull request and get it added to the library. Really open to that, really encouraging folks to do that. The coverage, I would say, is good for the SharePoint API. We've got, I think, most of the core functionality covered, but there's stuff on the edges I know stuff on the edges we haven't covered yet. So in that sense, we do not have as much coverage as either raw REST or the SharePoint HTTP client, and likely never will if we're really honest with ourselves, because we'll never be 100% caught up to the API. But the ease of use is sort of the other balancing point to that, where we handle all of the plumbing and all of sort of the back-end JSON construction and things like that for you, and give you back nice typed sets of results. And that's extensible using your own custom business objects as well. So you can easily have objects with your own properties and own methods and get those loaded from SharePoint and then operate on those objects or bind them directly to a template. So the fact we don't have 100% API coverage, I think, is balanced by the ease of use. But if there's a new API introduced, there's always going to be a lag before it'll be introduced into the JS core. So something to keep in mind. That's one of the benefits of the SharePoint HTTP client. So hopefully ease of use is, again, our key. And if that's important to you, I think the JS core would be a good fit for you. So future goals. Where are we trying to take the library? What are our thoughts about the future? And this will change, right? Everything changes over time. Both the SharePoint Framework and the JS core will continue to evolve. That evolution will be a little bit in parallel. Like I said, we're always talking with the SharePoint Framework folks. We're being responsive to the work they're doing. They're, of course, leading the way, but we're being responsive and making sure we continue to work smoothly. Our goal is to continue to simplify the development experience. So working on an extensible pipeline, growing the developer guide and the wiki in general. We're working always on more samples, and we continue to expand that SharePoint REST API coverage. And that is all driven by community feedback. So your feedback and participation is key to this library growing in the way that is most helpful. So if you, again, see functionality that isn't there, see functionality that's broken, let us know. That's, will help us construct our roadmap, help us guide the development effort. Of course, absolutely encourage you to submit pull requests, build some functionality, let us get it merged in. And that goes for all those things. We're open and welcoming for help on the developer guide and wiki, creating samples, the whole everything, right? So it's an open source community project, so your feedback is key. But that's kind of our sort of general thoughts right now. And if you have thoughts, please share them with us. We'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. One of the things maybe to mention on this one is the provisioning. That's a classic discussion point. Let's not spend too much time on it, but we used to have a provisioning, JavaScript-based provisioning in the PnP-JS core, but that has been now relocated. So it has it will be maybe published as its own library at some point.
Yes. So actually, interesting you brought that up. We've had a person has submitted about 12 pull requests to that, so somebody has picked that up and has started working on that, and your help is welcome there, of course, too. So there's a provisioning JavaScript core library there as well. So if you're interested in provisioning from Node, check that out. It might be something you find helpful and something you find interesting to work on or contribute to. So
True.
A good thing to keep in mind. So check that out. So we'll finish here with a quick call to action. First one, use the core library. Use sp-pnp-js in your projects. Check it out. Use it. See if it's easier for you. I believe it will be, and I believe you'll find it really helps with your productivity and helps you get started with the REST development a little bit quicker. Join our bi-weekly call. So we have a bi-weekly call. So our next one is March 30th. 2017. So if you're listening to this, whenever you're listening to this in the future, March 30th, 2017 is the next call from when we're recording this. But what we talk about in there, it's focused on SharePoint Framework. It's focused on SharePoint client-side development in general, and focused on the core library. So those are kind of our three JavaScript core libraries. So those are kind of our three topic areas. And we talk about those things. We do updates for the SharePoint Framework, what's new, and we also welcome and encourage community demos. We've had some really great demos from folks in the community around SharePoint Framework or around the JavaScript core library or just around SharePoint client-side development in general. So it might be an add-in. We had a neat demo on the script link functionality for sort of classic SharePoint a couple weeks ago. So really good stuff. If you have a cool demo, we'd love to see it. We'd love for you to join the call, be part of the community. And then finally, provide feedback. So that feedback can come on that bi-weekly call. The issues list, let us know if you find bugs or have questions. We have a Gitter channel tied to the JavaScript core library repo, so you can ask questions and get some feedback there. And then as well, the Microsoft Tech community is another great place for your feedback and ideas. So that's my call to action to you guys. Use the library, join the call, join the community, and provide feedback. And then I'll kind of add a fourth hidden bullet point of, submit pull requests, really looking for folks to jump in and contribute as well. So don't feel like you're limited to just submitting issues. We are open and welcome to pull requests.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So with that, I think we're all done. I hope our webcast here has answered the question, what is the JavaScript core library from Patterns and Practices? How should I use it? When should I use it? And how does it relate to SharePoint Framework? And what might we be doing with it in the future? So hopefully those questions have been answered. If you have more, please let us know. And like I said, we've done a couple of these, and likely we'll do another in the future. So let us know.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add either, except that the year on the slide is wrong, so that should be obviously 2017. Never mind. But
deck from you, buddy.
But thank you, Patrick. Awesome run through on the PnP-JS core, when what's happening and what's actually going on and what are we planning to do in the future. And we, like Patrick said, we absolutely encourage people to try it out, give us feedback. If it works, it's fine, or if you don't like it, tell us why. Quite often people tend to say that, hey, but this is kind of hiding all of my HTTP REST operation and headers and everything else, and that can be considered a good thing. But if you would like to build your own stuff for the REST calls, yeah, you can still do that. Just don't use the library. I would say that all of that information is in the background. You can still access that, and you can control stuff. You can still do all of the classic things, but the PnP-JS core makes the development easier, and that's no doubt the main objective. But thank you, Patrick. I think that's it. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening, and we'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Thank you.